Hi, everybody. This is Arthi from Human Chapters. I'll tell you a little bit about human chapters. Humans are living narratives with a past, present, and future. These narratives constitute of a number of chapters across a lifespan. The aim of these conversations is to highlight a chapter of the narrative and unpack its connections to other chapters. I don't care whether people are natural storytellers, but I truly do believe each one of us has a worthy story to share. In acknowledgement to country, we acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we meet. We pay respect to their tribal elders, past and present and emerging. We celebrate their continuing culture and we acknowledge the memory of their ancestors. Today, we welcome Eamon to Human Chapters, and we're going to be talking about the role of speech pathology in education. Welcome, Eamon. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Hi, Artie. Thanks for that introduction. It's lovely to be here. I think it's a really good sentiment podcast. And I know a few of my colleagues at La Trobe have featured recently, so it's nice to join the ranks. So my name's Eamon Charles. I'm currently working as an academic within the Science of Language and Reading Lab in the School of Education at La Trobe University. So I work under the directorship of Professor Pamela Snow, who many people will know, and Professor Tanya Seri. I have a bit of a split role at the moment. Part of it is supporting our key research priorities. So we have, in particular at the moment, we do have some quite large scale research projects occurring, which is really exciting. We've been lucky to receive a lot of generous philanthropic support recently, and which has meant that we've got lots to do, but lots of exciting and impactful work. And then I also do some teaching within the School of Education as well, currently across subjects related to language and literacy. So that is me now. I'm a speech pathologist by background. Um, Probably I graduated in 2018, so 7 or 8 years out now. I have previously worked in early childhood intervention initially after graduating. So I spent a couple of years there working for an early childhood intervention service, and that was predominantly in the preschool years, I'd say, where most of my client base was. And then that was in Melbourne, and then in the beginning of the pandemic, which we don't talk about anymore, my wife and I decided to move back to Gippsland, which is where we're from, which was timely given everything that was going on. And then I actually moved into a role in education with the education department down here and spent a couple of years in that role, and also had the opportunity to take on a team leader role for a period of time as well. And then was lucky enough when this opportunity came up at La Trobe to get an interview and get the job, which has been such an incredibly exciting period of my career the last couple of years working in the Soul Lab team, and looking forward to whatever comes next.
Mm. That's incredible, Eamon. A while ago, we were talking about just that speech pathology background for actually quite a few people at La Trobe in education. Tell us what drew you to education and perhaps how speech pathology has helped the knowledge,
Yes,
which has helped.
yeah,
Yeah.
we're definitely. So if you look at our core team at the moment, nearly everyone I think has a background in speech pathology, and some of them, my incredibly smart and talented colleagues have multiple hats that they wear. So um, there's obviously we share a connection there through speech pathology. A lot of us, obviously Professor Pamela Snow and Professor Tanya Seri have a speech pathology background, as well as Dr. Nathaniel Swain. He has speech pathology in his background with a few other things as well, as does Dr. Tessa Weedman. And we have a few other colleagues now who are working with us in some different spaces who also bring a speech pathology background as well. I think Kyra Edwards, you spoke to recently, has been doing some work in some of my subjects and across a few of our research projects. And then we also have people with cognitive psychology background and a teaching background as well. So it's a really multidisciplinary team. But the School of Education does, I think, value the lens that speech pathology has brought, particularly into the language and literacy space. as La Trobe have gone about reworking their curriculum to align with preparing pre-service teachers to be able to teach structured literacy in a really systematic and explicit way.
Mm.
So yeah, that has meant that there's been some opportunities for some speech pathologists to come into the fold and then to work together with those with a teaching and education background and those with a cognitive psychology background as well. I think what first drew me to education, it was probably slightly pragmatic in that I got a job in the education department. Prior to that, in early childhood intervention services, I was working kind of in and out of a variety of settings. So in that type of role, you're in the home sometimes, or sometimes you're in an early childhood centre, or sometimes you're even visiting your clients at schools. So you do get a sense of different systems and different settings. And then a role came up within the education department, and I just took it. I hadn't done much work at all in literacy prior to stepping into education. I'd done a lot in supporting clients with pre-literacy skills, so lots of oral language support, speech support, phonemic awareness support prior to formal school starting. And it wasn't until I started in the education department within the Gippsland area where I live that my boss at the time, her name's Erin Waters, she's a fantastic speech pathologist as well, introduced me, I guess, to the world of literacy and I guess all the opportunities and the challenges that the system was experiencing at that point in time. That was a point of time where policy was still probably supporting what you'd call a balanced literacy approach. So, but there were many people within the department who were advocating for change, and speech pathologists, as well as a whole range of other people in schools and teachers and school leaders were advocating for that change. So I kind of stepped into that policy environment, which was, fascinating, and it took a little bit to get kind of my head around what I needed to know, I think, as a speech pathologist, and then how I could work with teachers in a way that was collaborative.
Mm.
I think I've evolved my thinking a lot probably over the last 5 years now to maybe understand how that role of speech pathology in education can be more systematic.
Mm.
And that depends, I think, on a range of systemic factors, at the policy level. And if we are to have a truly multi-tiered systems of support, across schools, I think about the role of speech pathology within that type of framework. And my time working kind of at a regional level in the department was, my experiences were that you could step into any number of schools at that point, and you would be looking at different curriculums, different pedagogical models, and different assessment models. So adapting your services, whether you're coming in to provide some tier one support or coming in to provide some more targeted tier two or tier three support, was difficult because you were kind of stepping in and out of different systems with entirely different structures and also sometimes beliefs about what children needed to learn and how they were going to learn that. So I think I learned a lot about maybe, while with the best intentions, we could go in with the best intentions, but unless maybe some of those systemic factors were in place, it was actually hard to have sustained impact and change. So I think that's what I've been thinking about a lot the last 2 to 3 years since joining the School of Education at La Trobe, and thinking about, well, how can we fit speech pathologists within a multi-tiered systems of support or a response to intervention framework, so that the support is targeted, we're using it on the students who need it most, and we're using it in a way that's impactful and effective. So yeah, I've got a lot of questions in that space. I'm not sure if I've got answers. There might be others out there with answers, but I think that's where I spend a lot of my time thinking at the moment.
Um, Eamon, I'd love to go back a few steps and when you said your boss, at the time, Erin Waters, introduced
Yes. Yeah.
you to the world of literacy, um, what did that look like specifically to, I suppose, that triad of knowledge, stakeholders, and policy? Um, yeah.
Yes. Yes. So yeah, Aaron supported me to do a range of professional learning to kind of upskill in like learning about systematic synthetic phonics and training in specific programs, which I guess was um, almost counter to the policy level that the broader department had at the time. So there was this interesting dynamic of people who were advocating for change, the change that we are now seeing, kind of having to almost go against the grain or against the policy in order to support their workforce to build that knowledge to help make that change. So it just meant that it was a complex environment. Supporting schools was complex because if you wanted to support schools in, say, an approach that aligns with what we consider to be kind of explicit, systematic, structured literacy, you really had to work with a coalition of the willing. It didn't make a lot of sense to necessarily try and implement change within a school as one person stepping in for a limited amount of time, because that's not how change works, and look, we know that from implementation science. So it was just, yeah, it was a really interesting time, I think, to work in such a big organization like that, which has so many arms and so many different priorities as well. So yeah, I'm really grateful for that initial introduction I got, and you're working within that team. I sort of really learned about the link between oral language, which I had focused on a lot in my early childhood intervention work, and how that can build a bridge to learning to read, write, and spell, which I think is a analogy I've probably taken from one of my bosses, Pamela Snow. She uses that bridge analogy a lot, and that one of the key purposes that we want from education is children to have the freedom that literacy brings and the opportunities that it brings and the doors that it opens for them. So I think I started to think about a lot of my work as a speech pathologist as contributing to that outcome in some way. So whether that is supporting oral language, because we know oral language or language comprehension is a significant component of learning to read, or whether that was actually working in a more targeted way on the word recognition component of reading, or thinking about how those become integrated over time. I started to get a clearer picture, I think, over the course of a couple of years about how everything I could do in education as a speech pathologist was really kind of contributing to that outcome of supporting students to become independent, skilled readers, writers, and spellers, because we know that that is a significant protective factor in their lives moving forward, and that's what will help them have opportunities and be able to make the choices that they want with their lives, to live kind of whatever life they would like to live. So I think that clarity certainly helped over time. And I think now, with some of the system change that we're seeing at the policy level as well, I think that clarity is also coming down from above, which hasn't always necessarily been the case. And I think that's something I've learned. I've worked in 3 larger organizations now, and to have that clarity coming down from a policy level or from senior executive leadership about what you want to achieve, then it's easier to align your role to that and think about, well, here's how my role can actually help us achieve that purpose that the system is saying is a priority for us. So, and I think that's where multi-tiered systems of support can come in, because we can have this overarching framework which supports us in education to think about outcomes in a similar way, to hopefully think about principles that underline curriculum, instruction and assessment in a similar way as well,
Mm.
and then think really systematically and systemically, so I should say as well, about how we can support all children with whatever resources we have. So,
Yeah. Eamon, as you were talking, I wondered about a couple of things. I don't know about you as a speech pathologist, but I love models and I love sort of structuring my thinking around how does one part relate to another in relation to different models. And
mm,
I wondered about your thinking around the connection between oral, what models, if you use any in your thinking process, what models do you use to connect oral language to a model of reading to a model of writing, and that underpinning, considering that language is a lifelong skill. We keep
mm,
learning something every day.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Probably, like, I don't think there's if I talk about maybe reading and writing separately, and they're obviously integrated, but for the purposes of like models and frameworks, I might talk about them separately. You know, I think most people, who have lived in this literacy space know about the simple view of reading, which breaks the product of reading comprehension down into two key components of language comprehension and word recognition. I think about that a lot, as I'm sure a lot of people do. Scarborough's reading rope is another theoretical model that helps us to understand the different components that go into skilled reading over time. And I think more importantly, can inform decisions that we need to make about curriculum, instruction, and assessment. Because of that, I think that's where models are most useful. It's not just helping us understand the processes of how something happens, but informing the decisions that we need to make and put into practice. So I know I'm going to say Sonia Cabell and Trisha, I think her first name is Tucker, have their Strive for Five framework. So if I go back to say the preschool years now, they talk about everything they do in that space in the context of Scarborough's reading rope or the simple view of reading, even though you're not necessarily at that point systematically
Mm.
teaching children to code, you can still conceptualize the work that you do with them as contributing to those uh, various components of those models. So if you're doing, lots of shared read alouds in kinder, I say kinder in the Victorian context, which is preschool, but I think kindergarten in other states is prep. But if you're doing lots of shared read alouds in 3-year-old or 4-year-old kinder, ideally you're doing a nice balance of narrative text and informational text. And hopefully those texts are built around a core topic or knowledge unit. And I think there's probably work to do in that space within the Australian Early Years Learning Framework. But if you're doing those shared read alouds and you're having, whether it's small group or a larger group, you're having rich discussions, you're doing all that kind of extra textual work to build children's understanding of the text. You're fitting in some vocab instructions, some opportunities for kids to use that new vocabulary, to define it, in a really playful and developmentally appropriate way. Like I do that with my daughter now, who's just turned 2. Like lots of the strategies I use in shared read alouds, I would use for your kids who are 4, 5, and 6. So you just adapt them slightly depending on the age of the child. And even when I work with my daughter now on shared books, I'm kind of, it's hard to switch off that part of your brain. I'm thinking about, well, this is contributing towards her knowledge of text structures, her, vocabulary breadth and depth, which are both so important. Where exposing kids, or in this case, I'm exposing my daughter through those shared texts to longer, more complex sentences. So all of these things come up in Scarborough's reading rope, for example, and we're putting the ingredients in at that point in time that are going to contribute to reading comprehension down the track. We know there's lots of other ingredients they need along the way. So I think, those are two theories and frameworks that are really helpful to come back to as a speech pathologist, as an educator, no matter what age you're working with kids at, because you can think about, well, this is what I'm doing with them now, and this is how it's going to contribute to this end product. There are other models as well. I don't think it's necessarily helpful to be so rigid with our use of theories or models. So, the indirect effects model, the active view of reading is one that's emerging and probably needs some more research, but it's another model I think we can look at. And I think where models and those frameworks are most useful is, what's their utility? What's it like for a practitioner to pick up and to use that model in a way that's going to inform them to make, the best bets they can about curriculum, instruction, and assessment. And that's probably something I've learned a lot about in the last 2 to 3 years is as a speech pathologist. I think it's easy to say step into a school and provide a service that could actually be quite separate from curriculum or instruction or assessment. And so that there's not necessarily any continuity there between what you might step in and provide and what's happening throughout the rest of the day. So I don't think that's necessarily a theoretical model or a framework, but I think as speech pathologists, we do need to think about curriculum, instruction, and assessment all the time. So how is the service I'm providing this student or this group of students or this school fitting within this school's model of curriculum, instruction, and assessment? And when I say curriculum, I'm probably talking curriculum more at the micro level, not necessarily the broader Australian curriculum, which many people would argue is probably more of a blueprint. I'm talking about maybe the specific curriculum that a school enacts, and whether that's kind of a knowledge-rich curriculum, for example, which is sequenced across the years and is coherent. There's so much that we could pull out of that as a speech pathologist and think about, all right, well, this is what this child needs to learn about in biology this term. I know that they're going to encounter, these pieces of vocabulary. I know this school is teaching vocabulary in an explicit and direct way, but this is a child who might have some vulnerabilities in learning vocabulary. So what can I do to either provide extra intensity potentially to the dosage that child is getting, or to work with the teacher around, how their instruction, like what the instruction looks like for them or what the assessment looks like for them. And that's not necessarily changing the delivery of instruction, but thinking about, what we could kind of tinker around with in terms of the amount of opportunities that child gets to respond in a lesson, or the amount of scaffolding they potentially get, on top of the whole class instruction. So coming back to some really core principles, I think, about how learning works is really important.
Yeah. No, that's wonderful. And that, Eamon, that's got me thinking about, I love how you broke it down into curriculum, instruction, and assessment, being part and parcel of our thinking if we want to go into school to provide a service that's sustainable. Because essentially, they're almost prescribing this is what needs to happen in this dose. And I feel like, even especially when I was first learning about the links between language and literacy, language is, because of the complexities, my understanding of a prescription was so diluted as a speech going, just do it this way or just do it that way. My instructions were so vague. Now they've become clearer over time, and it's been through a lot of errors, a lot of sort of trials and going, well, that's not working. But also something I personally found useful was when teachers and assistants came up and said, I don't understand that. Like, what do you
Mm,
mean? And I feel like that was such a, as confronting as it was, it makes sense in my brain. And I wish people could just jump into it and actually
mm.
know what I'm talking about. But it is so difficult to explain sometimes. And I'd love to almost even g- get into your journey about when you're teaching these students, how do you explain things so that there is ultimately that shared language?
Yeah, that's a really good point there. And you probably had me reflecting on, mistakes
Mm,
when I look back, kind of mistakes I made when I first stepped into education. And I think, a lot of people talk about that. You kind of learn the hard way a little bit. It is a complex system,
mm,
and, every school is unique
mm,
in terms of its ecosystem, in terms of the teachers, the students, we share lots of similarities and when we kind of go to school for the same purpose. But obviously each school can be its own system.
mm.
I think like about as a really practical example of, you know,
Okay. So, yes, Eamon, we were talking about an example of that communication where there's shared language or getting to.
yeah, yeah. So I was thinking about kind of mistakes I've made when stepping into schools to provide services where a service has been requested
Mm,
as a speech pathologist, and you think about, well, like, kind of what can I do to help this child or this group of children?
mm,
And I think about quite practical things that I certainly did in my first year or two in education around you'd go in, you'd do some form of assessment, you gather some information about the school context as well. You maybe had identified that maybe there are some of the children you're working with who need some more support with following
mm,
instructions or developing the complexity of instructions they can follow or learning prepositions. So you might come up with some activities and a short therapeutic program to target something like that. They're probably classic examples of things that speech pathologists might work with learners in schools on. And maybe you run the intervention, or maybe you oversee some other people in the school running the intervention. But when I look back at those types of things that I certainly did in those first, 1 or 2 years in education, and I think about, well, how did that actually link back to curriculum, instruction, assessment? You could argue, yes, those skills we were working on were important, but was I working on them in a way that was actually likely to be effective and improve
mm,
that child's kind of access to curriculum or improve maybe the instruction that they were getting, generally speaking?
mm,
And I would say probably not, and probably they weren't also really aligned with, multi-tiered systems of support. Because when I think about multi-tiered systems of support or response to intervention, I know there's controversy about which term we should use.
mm,
When I think about that now, I think about, well, really, we're needing to start with, at tier one, the high quality instruction in the classroom, and then look at a really specific and almost subskill level about what that child needs extra support with. And then whether that's, tier two small groups of support or more individualized tier three support, what we should be playing around with is, the amount of instruction they're getting. So the dosage, the intensity and the pace of that instruction in those small groups or individual sessions, the amount of scaffolding that we can play around with, the amount of I do, we do, you do, and guided practice before you get to independent practice. And I think, well, they're the principles that we should actually really be thinking about when we come to any intervention service, whether it be a speech pathologist or whether it be an intervention that a school's setting up with their teachers, rather than coming in and thinking about, additional activities for kids to learn. So, if I'm not working in schools directly at the moment, like we are involved with, hundreds of schools across our projects. And so I'm still in schools a lot and talk to people in schools all the time, but I'm not working for a school necessarily. But if I was, that's what I would really focus on now, is I would constantly think about what's my role and how does that link to the curriculum, the instruction that child gets, an assessment, and how can the service I provide, if I'm coming in to provide, a tier two or tier three intervention or oversee a tier two or tier three intervention, how can those interventions build off the tier one classroom and actually link back to what we've identified they're struggling with in tier one. And that's where I think having that really specific curriculum is helpful. And obviously having that common set of principles around how we're going to teach, how we're going to instruct, and how we're going to assess. And how do we know that those approaches are likely to work, which we will hopefully see, over the next 3 to 5 years. If you think in Victoria, the Victorian government's obviously made some significant shifts recently in terms of its literacy policy, but in terms of its overall instructional model, as are a lot of the Catholic systems in across Victoria as well. And we're doing some work with the Diocese of Ballarat Catholic Education Limited on a system-wide intervention that they're doing, and they've got an incredible team there, with Emma, Bree, and Holly. If you're listening, shout out to them. If you're wanting to learn about system-wide change, chat to them because they're doing incredible things there. And that's probably those mistakes that I reflect back on now are things that, I would see in newer graduates now when I talk to them, because when you go through your education as a speech pathologist, you probably are conceptualizing your role as an individual, potentially, working with individual kids, and you've got to come up with the learning activities or the therapeutic activities, and you've got to think about a therapeutic plan. But I don't know if that way of thinking necessarily translates to education all the time, because children are going to school for specific purposes, to learn specific things, to develop specific skills. And a lot of the work we do with them will actually be quite similar. Obviously, it will be individualized to whatever children's needs are, but it will share so much similarities in terms of what we're working on, how we're going about supporting that, and how we're assessing that. So I think there's probably some work to do there within probably speech pathology degrees as well, about thinking about our services in a systematic way. And you're not expecting a new graduate to go out and do that, but providing, new graduates opportunities to go out and work, in a really systematic way, rather than necessarily to go out as, a lone wolf that has to come up with all the therapeutic activities and the therapeutic plan and then implement that. But that could be good quality work, but it could go to waste because it doesn't actually necessarily align with those principles of multi-tiered systems of support, and might be actually disconnected from curriculum instruction or assessment. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
What it helped me think about, Eamon, and again, this is just how my brain works, is I need to structure and compartmentalize information, whether I'm in a conversation or I'm learning something. But two things that I thought about when you were talking is the role of the appreciation for speech pathologists having that deep lens into a student, and that's literally our training. And it doesn't have to be a student, it's anyone we work with, to go in terms of assessment, intervention, how do we get to know the person's story, their strengths, their challenges, and that's the depth of information that we have. I suppose it's a luxury and it's a privilege to be able to collate it all fairly quickly once you've got that experience. But then at the same time, then thinking about the MTSS, or response to intervention. Now, this is your 3-tier model to go with the knowledge and information we have. Now, where are we putting some of that into practice? Are we putting it when this child in relation to a whole class, in relation to a small group, or when we're working individually, or is it a combination of the three? And they're
Yeah.
the sort of, um, I suppose, the way of structuring and going at the end of the day, we can trial a few things, but actually get to understand what's working for the student when we implement something and where is it working? How is it working? How frequently do we need to be able to do it? And putting it in one area, does it actually affect other areas as well? So I think that's
Mm,
the shift that I've had to make recently, is to go that sort of ripple impact and effect, to go, where else is it helping
mm,
student, again, not even just thinking about purely speech pathology, but we spoke a little bit earlier about that integration. When we're learning something, we're integrating so many skills. We're integrating language skills, cognitive skills, um, any skill that we need to learn effectively is what we're putting in place at that time.
mm,
So
mm,
what are we actually looking at? And one thing could affect another. Um,
mm.
yeah.
Yeah, I really like that concept around, we're not just working at one tier of support. We can actually be working across, and you might be working with one student, but actually supporting them, across those potential tiers. I think a nice example of that is, let's say you're working with a child who has a developmental language disorder, or at least, some language difficulties that have been picked up.
Hmm.
And that they're more vulnerable in terms of something like vocabulary learning word definitions, using words in new contexts. So you might be able to work with them across a range of tiers. So if they're teaching vocabulary, via direct vocab instruction, kind of both within a text that's being read and then potentially pulling some words out of that text and breaking down and looking at the phonological and morphological components of them. You could work with the teacher around, well, how can we get this student some extra support within that tier one lesson? And you might have teachers who are confident enough to do that themselves. They don't necessarily need to talk to a speech pathologist, but you might have some who would like to talk to a speech pathologist about it because they know that one of the underlying barriers to this student is about language. So, you could talk to that teacher about, well, what are some things we can do to either increase the dosage that they're getting in tier one, or increase the scaffolding that they're getting, or to increase maybe the amount of guided practice they get before they get released to independent practice. And you could play around with some of those things. The teacher might call on that student an extra one or two times during a lesson to give them more opportunities to respond, which gives the teacher more feedback to then adapt their teaching to as well. So you're still at the tier one level, but you're looking at whether you call it differentiation at tier one or adaptive teaching to meet that student's needs, or you could chat to the teacher about what their instructional routines are, and are there some opportunities for this student to get a little bit more guided practice, and maybe there's some other students who need that as well, around learning a vocabulary definition before they're going away and doing some independent practice, as an example. Or, if you're calling upon students in class, whether you're calling upon non-volunteers, or people, or whether you want to call it cold calling or warm calling, whatever you call it, that student might just need a little bit of extra um, scaffolding to participate successfully in that technique. So that they might not, but that they might benefit from things such as um, you pre-warning them that you might call upon them. So you might say, "Oh, I heard that conversation you had in a pair share with Tim. That was a really great definition. I'm going to ask you about it when I ask my third question," or something like that. So, we know that if a child has a developmental language disorder, that it might be harder for them, obviously, to come up with a generative sentence on the spot. So one of the scaffolds you're making to your tier one teaching is providing some of that pre-warning so that they can experience that success. Or just by breaking off into pair shares before you call upon students to talk in front of the group, you're providing practice. So you're giving them an opportunity to practice with a pair, which all students could benefit from, but you could float around to different students in a targeted way and just listen into how they're going, explaining whatever it is that they need to explain to their peer. So you get an insight before you call on them, potentially. Or, you could encourage students, I'm going to give you 10 seconds to think. So give that processing time. I want you to jot down your ideas, then turn and talk to a partner. And then we might come back and turn whatever we've jotted down into a proper sentence, and then I'll get you to read that sentence. So you're providing a whole layers of scaffolding that when that student gets to talk in front of the group, they're able to read out their sentence, which they've taken some time to construct, and they don't have to generate it on the spot. So you could do all that work at tier one, but also be potentially supporting that student in some sort of tier two or tier three intervention. And all of those things are, increasing dosage in some way, they're increasing scaffolding in some way, they're playing around with the gradual release of responsibility in terms of, that I do and we do that guided practice towards independent practice. So we don't necessarily have to just be rigid and target, one tier. I think I'm really glad you raised that. We can think about how we can influence all tiers. And a lot of it comes back to those, common principles of RTI or MTSS.
And Eamon, when you're teaching your subjects in your role of teaching, to get information now, I'm not sure. Are you working with first years or like all through?
Largely first and second years at the moment. Yeah, in the undergraduate. Yeah.
Yeah. Please tell me, what is your process around some of the subjects you are doing and the knowledge you're trying to impart? And actually, even then thinking about that backward design, what would you love your students to get out of, even if you give me one specific example of a subject?
Yeah, good question. So at the moment, I'm largely working on two subjects. So I'm coordinating a subject currently. We're halfway through. I don't know if any of my students will be listening, but hello if they are, called Introduction to Language and Literacy. So that's a first year subject, which students in our undergraduate program from all streams do. So whether that's they're in an early childhood and primary stream, just a primary stream, or they go on to a secondary stream. I also teach in a second year subject called teaching reading, which really focuses on the practical components of teaching reading in the classroom and intervention. And it's a very practice focused subject. And I've taught that one for a couple of years, and I'm helping one of my colleagues, Dr. Tessa Weidman, in some of the coordination with that this year. That is just a subject for the primary students or the students in the primary and early childhood degree. So the secondary students don't necessarily do that. So by working across both those subjects, I can think about sequencing a lot, because we ideally want that subject in the first year, the Introduction to Language and Literacy, to build a base of theoretical knowledge. So when they get to second year, we can jump into actually applying it to practice, as quickly as possible. University semesters fly. They can be 12 weeks, but they can be 9 or 10 weeks when you factor in things like placement. So there is not a lot of time. And while we can prioritize the need to know from the nice to know, there's still a lot to learn. So we've had an opportunity this year with some of our schools' reaccreditation processes that came about through the new core content requirements, through the Teacher Education Expert Panel report released last year, which is requiring schools of education to teach kind of common core content focused a lot around evidence-based practice. And that's something that La Trobe University has embraced. And a lot of that work we've been kind of commenced, for 4 or 5 years now. So we're well underway, but can obviously always improve. And by reaccrediting the first year subject this year, we could beef it out with that really important pedagogical content knowledge that they're going to need, so that when that second year subject starts, we can jump into the actual aspects of instruction and assessment, hopefully more quickly, because probably previously to that, in that second year subject, we were thinking about, well, we're trying to teach them the code, but then we're also trying to teach them how to teach the code. And that's a lot, just to fit in alone, as well as all the other components of reading that we need to fit in. So in our first year subject this year, without giving away too much, we're thinking about, well, what are the foundational knowledge that they will need, so that when they come to teaching reading or relevant subsequent subjects in the secondary stream, they have that really shared understanding of what reading, writing, and spelling is, how they develop, and what theories we can use to inform how we go about putting together curriculum and instruction and assessment models that relate back to those theories. So, there are things that we need to do to build a base. We've got to build a shared understanding of what is language. What is the role of oral language in supporting learning? Obviously, we know oral language is so important to social emotional development as well, so that comes into it. But trying to think less about oral language from a developmental perspective, like we maybe would in a speech pathology degree, and think about, well, how does it show up in the classroom? So let's look at, shared read alouds. Let's look at why the language of text is different from oral language. Let's talk about oral language as a biologically primary skill and what that means for how it develops. It's still a vulnerable biologically primary skill. And Pam wrote a great blog about that recently. But it obviously differs then from written language, which is a biologically secondary skill. So we spend a lot of time on those concepts, because understanding those concepts is going to hopefully influence how we go about teaching those skills in school, because we don't necessarily support a biologically primary skill in the same way we would a biologically secondary skill. We then look at what are going to be some high utility frameworks and models related to reading and writing. And let's dive into those now in first year and think about some foundational implications of those, so that when they come to second year, they can start applying them. And we've obviously got to do things as well, like teach the students, the pre-service teachers, the code. They might not have learnt that explicitly themselves. We've got 44 sounds in standard Australian English. We have other dialect variations of English as well, which we touch on. We learn about the English orthography, why we have a deep and opaque orthography. How does that compare to some other orthographies out there? You often hear people saying in Finland they don't teach kids to read until they're 7 or 8, but Finland has a very different orthography. So we know that's not necessarily going to work in English. So we try and bust some of those myths as well. So we're trying to build that foundational knowledge of English language and English phonology and English orthography in this first year subject, as well as those theories of reading and writing that are really important, or that we think have high utility. There are a range of theories out there that I think you can use. Like, I'm not necessarily rigid on which ones, but we need to prioritize, because we only have so much time about the ones that we choose to teach. And then, when they get into second year, which is a really fun subject to teach, we start to think about, well, how do we teach systematic synthetic phonics? Let's practice that. What's universal screening? Let's practice delivering dibbles, for example. What are some other diagnostic assessments that we might need to do when we look at a dibbles data set? Let's think about knowledge-rich curriculum and how we can incorporate vocabulary instruction in that. Let's practice teaching that. So yes, that's fun. That's really practical, that second year subject. And I think over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, we've been just kind of finessing with them this stream of subjects and thinking about, how does one lead into the other? And then how can we use that second year subject as well to review the content that would have come up in the first year subject, because I think universities, there's, the churn, you do your semester, the students might forget about it. They do another semester, they forget about it. And
Mm.
we know that doesn't necessarily align with principles of cognitive science or principles of how learning happens. And we have constraints there, I think, within the tertiary sector that often we have these 12-week semesters or short-term based blocks as well. So, that review, which is really important, can be hard to incorporate. And so we're trying to counter that, but it is difficult because you usually only get one lecture or one tutorial a week. It's a bit different to, if you're in front of students 4 or 5 days a week, where it's
Yeah.
still hard work, but you've obviously got more opportunities. So yeah, we're playing around with things in our tutorials. We try and incorporate a weekly review where we're spiraling content from previous weeks, which we think is really important content to keep coming back to ensure that they've got those concepts.
Mm.
Whether they will retain that for a year before they come across that next subject is probably harder to say.
Mm.
But yeah, we're playing around with different things, I guess, within the constraints of the semesters and terms that all tertiary organizations have. So yeah, I think that's a huge other area as well. I don't know if there's anyone out there listening to this that has thoughts on that, how we can kind of think about those principles of learning and principles of cognitive science within the tertiary sector. If they are, I'd love to chat to them.
Um, I was listening to a podcast just yesterday, and the so it's called Sweat the Technique is the name of the podcast.
Oh
Um,
yes, by Doug Lenov. Yeah.
yes, yes, it's
Yes.
fantastic.
Yeah.
And one of the ones I haven't yet finished listening to it, but it was the knowledge organizer. And
Mm,
at a secondary level, the guest was talking about how he organizes the knowledge the students need to know for history in specific categories of dates and times, and thinking about that idea of knowledge organizers.
mm,
Actually, I was also reading Nathaniel Swain's book, and again, that idea of knowledge organizer at primary, secondary, tertiary, even in
mm,
adulthood, I just feel like there's some principles that can transfer throughout,
mm.
from again simple to complex, and thinking about, yeah, how what's important to know, how do we review it, and if we keep reviewing it as it is, or thinking about it in relation when we're listening to other things, our learning actually does get deeper.
Yeah, that's if one of my colleagues is listening to this, Sue Highland, who's worked on a few of these subjects with me, she'll love that you mentioned knowledge organizers in the tertiary setting. Because yeah, we've had a few conversations about that. We haven't got there yet, but how we can maybe utilize them to try and counter against maybe some of those factors
Mm.
that are built into the structures that we have at university, which
Yeah.
mean that kids can forget things as a way. So yeah, that's something that we've had some conversations about. But yeah, we've definitely, I think, got some work to do in that space for how we can tap into some of those things a bit more and apply them to our context. And I think another thing as a speech pathologist as well, working with pre-service
Mm.
teachers, I'm very cognizant of that. So the knowledge that I need or I needed is
Mm.
potentially different from the knowledge that they need
Yeah.
in order to go and do their job, at least at a graduate level. And they're obviously going to build their knowledge over time. We're
Mm.
lifelong learners in whether we're in education or service-based professions.
Yes.
So that's been a really interesting exercise, I think, in taking what do I know about oral language, for
Mm.
example, which we think is bread and butter of speech pathologists,
Yeah.
and what do I need to hold back so that I'm actually just prioritizing the things that these pre-service teachers need to know, which are hopefully going to influence their practice. That's probably the key thing. We're wanting them to step out and be really skilled literacy practitioners,
Yeah.
and they don't necessarily, need to know all the ins and out of language development, but they obviously need to have a sense of it. But then they need to think really practically about the areas of language that are really important, to learning and potentially, to social and emotional well-being at school. So, things like let's really dig into vocabulary, which is part of language and potentially going to be more important for them than, let's really go deep on on the language centers in the brain, for example. And you can still certainly touch on that, and we do touch on it in a sense when we go over key ideas like humans are hardwired to acquire language. We do have centers in our brains that allow us to pick up language when we're in those highly interactive environments. But we don't necessarily, I think, need to go deeper than that, certainly at an undergraduate level for education. So kind of brokering that knowledge and translating that knowledge is a challenge. And there's something that if you're a speech pathologist in education, I think you do need to think about, kind of go through the feedback I get from students. And there's kind of always like one or two comments around, oh, like, there's a lot of information, maybe I'm feeling the cognitive load here, and that's valuable feedback. So it's an opportunity to think about, okay, let me reflect on that. What was need to know? What was nice to know? What could I actually pare back and, hold for now? We don't necessarily want to throw all our darts at the board. We just want to throw the ones that are going to hit the bullseye. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's a challenge, but I think it's also a challenge if you're working in a school because you're needing to kind of broker the knowledge that you have in a way that the practitioners within that school can use it. So
Oh, it's always a learning curve
yes, yeah.
every day. Oh, that was too much, wasn't it? Oh, I'm really sorry. No, thank you so much for that. The other part and I know I've looked at the time. You are you able to say anything about the research component of your role and you,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
I can talk in broad terms. Most of it is still in the field, so I don't have data to report back yet.
Mm,
I'm currently working on a few, really exciting projects. We are working on a project with the Australian Educational Research Organisation, which is in its second year
mm,
of implementation. It's a 2-year project where we are working with 22 schools across
mm,
sectors, and all of those 22 schools receive a online professional learning program, as well as resources to support the implementation of at least systematic synthetic phonics.
mm,
But we have split those schools in half. So the one half of those schools is also getting instructional coaching. So we've got a range of coaches we're working with who are largely those with a teaching background, but there's also some with a speech pathology component to their background as well. And so they're going into schools and working with them, at a whole school level, but also at an individual teacher level and on instructional coaching. So that's a really exciting project where we're looking at, well, what are the effects of coaching
mm,
within this model? If we were, we don't necessarily have a lot of coaching roles within our systems in Australia, like they probably are more common in aspects of different American systems. And in that project, we've been lucky enough to work with Daryl McCall and Jan Hasbrook as well, which has been very cool. I've met a lot of amazing people in the last 2 or 3 years that I feel very privileged to have met.
mm,
So that's an exciting project. We also, as a university, received, I think I alluded to this earlier, but a generous philanthropic grant from the Batali Family Foundation, and they are funding a suite of projects, a few of which I'm working on. One of them is we are training pre-service teachers in I'm going to call it a word reading program,
Mm.
which is, yeah, it's a systematic synthetic phonics program, but it also incorporates elements of teaching spelling conventions. And they're going out into schools and providing one-on-one reading tutoring intervention 3 times a week. So that is a program that we're looking at for a range of reasons. We want to see what the effects are on the pre-service teachers in terms of their knowledge, their practices, their confidence, their experiences by participating in that project, by having a really scripted program to work with that they're trained in, that they're supported to implement. We're really interested in to see how does that impact their trajectory. And we're also wanting to ensure that the students that they're working with, who are all students who have been identified as being at risk of reading difficulties in the early years, are also making, ideally, accelerated learning growth from participating in that program. So we're working with a couple of schools in that project, and I'm heavily involved in that. So that's been really rewarding so far. And all the tutors that we have are super passionate about literacy, and they come to the project because they want to get more experience and they want to learn more about teaching reading, and they want to almost make that their specialist field of knowledge, which has been really exciting. And then we have a few other projects as well. We're in the process of launching one at the moment, which is going to be tracking outcomes, reading outcomes in rural schools, which is
Mm.
something quite close to my heart. I grew up in Gippsland, and I live there now, and I've worked there. So we know that rural and regional Australia, children are at a disadvantage in terms of reading outcomes. So we're wanting to track a range of schools and follow one cohort through for a couple of years to see what their reading outcomes are and what are the things that influence them, whether they influence them positively or potentially negatively. And yeah, they're probably the big three. There's a few other little things that we've done. Oh, I mentioned the work we're doing with the Diocese of Ballarat as well on their system-wide implementation of their Blair strategy, which is a an intervention that they're supporting, from the region,
Mm.
and the majority of schools are opting into it. And it's about, changing practice to align with a structured literacy approach, but
Mm.
it also incorporates knowledge-rich curriculum, and it's a really comprehensive suite of professional learning that they've developed in that team, and we're evaluating it. So we're tracking the outcomes across the 5 years. So looking at student data, but also looking at the experiences of teachers, the experiences of the students themselves, the
Mm.
experiences of the parents, to see kind of what the impacts are of such a system-wide implementation. So yeah, I've learned so much just from being involved with so many schools, to varying degrees over the last 3 years. Met so many amazing people doing so much amazing work in schools. There's so much expertise out there,
Mm.
which has probably flown under the radar, which we need to tap into more
Mm.
within our systems. And yeah, that's the privilege, I guess, of this role at La Trobe. I've been able to zoom out a little and almost get a bird's eye view
Mm.
of things, which has given me different ideas for if I was ever to zoom back in and work at a more localized level of how I'd maybe go about things. So
Yeah, that's amazing. Eamon, thank you so much for sharing your chapter so generously. As we are wrapping up, is there anything that you've wanted to say that I haven't asked, or just, yeah?
no, I don't think so. I think yeah, it's been great chatting, and I think it's you don't get opportunities to reflect, I guess, on your experiences necessarily. So this has been a nice one to bring a few things together and create a bit of a story for myself, and kind of understand my story a little bit as well. So
Mm.
I'll just say if there's anyone out there, do reach out. Maybe you can put my Latrobe email in the show notes
Absolutely.
or something. If you're a speech pathologist working in the school and you'd like to chat, I'd certainly love to chat.
Yeah.
And if you're an early career speech pathologist as well, thinking about your role in education, I'd certainly be really interested in chatting to more early career speech pathologists about that. So yeah, do reach out if anyone's listening, and I'd love to learn more about what you're doing. And yeah, we could just have a chat and see if there's anything I can do to support you.
Awesome. Thank you so very much, Eamon. I really do appreciate your time and effort and energy put into this conversation. And thanks in advance to everybody else that's going to be listening to this conversation. Please share the love. So many people might be able to get a few nuggets out of it. We never know where the story leads to after it's been published, but it's going to be available on Human Chapters YouTube channel and Human Chapters podcast across the different platforms. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.